Can we come to a common understanding of what good teaching is?
See, now, maybe we disagree about this.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. What do you think?
No. No, and I don't think that, do we have a common definition of what a good family is? What a good mother is like, what a good father is like. I mean, of course we have some common definitions, but there are also some common disagreements among us. And so parents who would, when I boast about our school that it helps kids learn to develop their own viewpoint, there are some parents who don't want kids to develop their own viewpoint. I mean, I'm not attacking them. They would say that openly and frankly. There are some parents who I think misguidedly, and some teachers who misguidedly think that you have to fill up the empty vessel before it can think for itself.
I find it amazing that principals in the state of Ohio are going around telling parents that they know what their kids are achieving on the basis of these tests, on which they've never read the technical manual, they've never studied the test, and they don't know what a passing score is. They're lying to people, and they ought to quit it. They ought to tell the truth, which is, I don't really know what this test covers. We're just trying to get kids through it so they can have a diploma. And if you really want to know, call your state legislator. If parents started doing that, if hundreds of parents started calling legislators in Ohio demanding to know what the test really measures, I think the test would go away. Because they don't have an answer for it, and they can't pass it either.
I'm just going to say a few things myself before I introduce the panelists. And one is that I am truly happy to be here because I have been waiting for this as a journalist. I've been waiting for effective educators to seize the leadership in transforming the schools that have left kids behind. One study I'll mention that was done in the Chicago Public Schools by researchers at the University of Chicago and University of Wisconsin found that students who received assignments requiring more challenging intellectual work also achieved greater than average gains on both state and national tests. Now, I'm not saying test scores should be the goal, but the apparent lack of attention to this kind of research about what actually does produce higher test scores has left me longing for the effective teachers to stand up and go public, and that's part of what we're about today. So I am thrilled that the effective educators of National Louis University, of the Golden Apple Foundation, of the Forum for Education and Democracy, and other such organizations are getting political about school improvement. So our program is, we'll start with George, and then go to Debbie, and then go to Bill, and they will each speak about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to moderate a discussion among them, and then you all will get together to do some brainstorming.
Here are the threats. It starts with a narrow definition of school success based virtually solely on standardized test scores, which are related to nothing else that we can see. The second threat, the centralized control of schools, both out of Washington, D.C. and out of the state houses throughout the country. The third threat, abandonment of work we know is successful in response to the pressure on testing and in response to the centralized control. And finally, a fourth threat, a national ignorance or unwillingness to deal with the other pressing issues such as the condition of childhood and school equity issues. Those are completely off the table in national policy discussions. And we felt those four conditions threatened the schools, the school reform networks, the teachers that we all knew and loved. And we felt it was important to stand up and do something about it. And from that came the forum. Now, these threats, we believe, were all sort of wrapped up in a popular narrative about schools, and the narrative kind of goes something like this. And this is not our narrative, mind you, okay, so I'm going to try and give you what I understand to be a narrative about schools that I think threatens what we're about. The narrative goes this way. Our public schools are a failure, and we cannot trust school people to fix them. The only hope is to force them to improve by holding them to externally imposed standards and regulations, and if they don't meet these standards and regulations, we'll punish the children and the teachers in those schools and ultimately privatize them. NCLB has diverted resources from horribly under-resourced schools around an agenda that has no evidence that it will succeed. The state I live in, Ohio, spends $68 million a year on the testing of children to meet NCLB mandates. $68 million a year. Every year, Not once, every year. By the way, every single dime of it goes to North Carolina, because that's where the tests come from. All right, so none of it's spent on kids. This is a state, I want to point out, that has been found by its Supreme Court 4 consecutive times to be illegally funding their schools so that they're inequitable, and which refuses to do anything about that issue, but readily sends $68 million every year for a set of tests that, as far as I can tell, nobody knows what they measure.
I've been operating an elementary school for the last 10 years, and I'm appalled and sympathetic as I watch them and my own grandchildren, balance the extraordinarily busy lives they live and the needs of young children. Compassion for our fellow citizens is the first victim of such stress. The second is authentic learning. It's not, however, just conservatives who have turned our schools into Dickensian, how do you pronounce it? Dickensian, thank you, Dickensian drudge mills, but liberals and too many of our staunchest civil rights advocates. For the first time in our history, we have more, not less, dropouts. And I would argue it's not disconnected from what we have allowed schools to continue to be and increasingly become. The motives of the drivers behind NCLB, which fixes in law are misplaced obsessions, vary. But between them, they have helped create a climate that removes democracy from our schoolhouses. Folks like us who advocate a different kind of childhood are on occasion labeled elitists, failing to confront the gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged that requires that we throw overboard the frills of childhood, along with the frills of local democracy. The American public, if given a list of all the possible professions or occupations in America, consistently puts teachers as number one, politicians, businessmen, all the rest of those way down below. So how is it we've turned accountability over to them who are trusted least? The current focus on narrowly defined academics, starting more or less at birth, is, I would argue, a frill. Likewise, the current test-oriented approach to defining academics deprives the least powerful of precisely what academia at its best offers: the ability to use one's mind agilely, freely, and with the utmost self-discipline. The ending of recess, the ignoring of arts and crafts, of shop and music are signs of peril to human intellect, and grandiose as this will sound, they are a threat to democracy, which rests on both intellectual skepticism and empathy. Those are the two underpinnings, both of democracy and of play. Yes, that's what play is all about. Skeptical, fantasy, and empathy. America's traditional skepticism about academia was not wholly unwarranted. Who can be sold on the barren version offered our young? Not me and not you. Dropping out is the end product of years of boredom, disengagement, and resultant failure. That old and not dishonorable tradition of respect for practical smarts, so rampant in our own history, is alive and well still. Bringing the two together so that academic smarts and real-life smarts join forces is the task of schools. It's what adults can help young people accomplish. That's what adults are for, parents and teachers. Who else is going to bring those two together?
One of the things we have to do is name the moment, and I think George and Debbie have done it very, very well. But I would argue, I'll put it in somewhat starker terms. I think we're witnessing the end of public education, or at least a movement to create the destruction of public schools. And I think we can see lots of things, the obsession with a single standard as the only measure of what's accomplished and so on is one example. The zero tolerance, which has swept the country. All the metaphors of the market, which, as George points out, have proven nothing, and yet those metaphors have a certain kind of, a kind of grip on the public imagination. I think we have to challenge those things. Miles Horton, who was a great, great educator and one of the generators of the civil rights movement, used to talk in terms of, and he said, in all social movements, there are mountain times and valley times. In mountain times, everybody knows what to do. You kind of get swept away. But in valley times, you have to study, you have to learn, you have to develop a vocabulary, you have to organize, which incidentally is the opposite of whining. Organizing is not whining. Organizing is actually, it's going to see other people, and it's also leaving your comfort zone. It's leaving the zone of the progressives that you like to hang out with and going out and talking to the people you don't like to hang out with and bringing something to them. And that's a wonderful, that's a wonderful pedagogical moment, because when you speak to people who don't agree with you, you have to listen to them as well. You have to understand their perspective and then find a better way and deepen your own understanding of what the message is. Remember Jonathan Kozol. Why is Kozol's book, just another example, why is The Shame of the Nation a bestseller? Why is The Covenant a bestseller? Because there's a debate in this country about these issues. We have to be in the debate, and we have to help frame the debate. So a couple other framing things. And I know as teachers, we sometimes feel like, well, I don't want to be political, and I didn't sign up for this for politics. But Ron Edmonds, a great Harvard researcher, once said, creating good schools for black urban kids is not a question of social science. We know the social science. It's a question of politics. It's a question of political will. Are we willing to do it? And we have to be on the side that says we're not only willing, but we're willing to fight for it. So reframing the debate includes, in my view, reframing the debate about the achievement gap and thinking about what would be involved in ending the education debt. It means reframing in the way George and Debbie talk so brilliantly about it, about the purpose of schooling and the question of citizenship. When I asked local school council members in Chicago over many years to describe what they would put in their schools if they had the power, what values that would be reflected in their schools if they had the power to do anything, and it was always things like love and cooperation and empathy and concern for others. It wasn't test scores. So the idea that we've lost that battle is a mistaken idea. It's a contested space. One of the ways I think we need to reframe the debate is invest in teachers. Invest in communities and invest in teachers. If you say to somebody just randomly out in Chicago, would you like it if your kids got higher test scores? The answers are yes. And if you said, do you think it makes sense to invest in teachers so we can get the best people in the classroom? They'll say yes. So the question is, where do you start the debate and how do you frame it? I think that this is a very exciting moment, a very exciting day, and I think George and Debbie are beginning something that could be the generator of a political movement that could shake the foundations of how this debate goes on. And I'm just thrilled to be here and that you're going to be a part of it. Thank you.
Types of schools we're talking about, I was struck by things like the hopefulness gap, the citizenship gap, ending the education debt, we have to have a completely different language. We can't, I am absolutely convinced we cannot buy into the current language because it's a loser. Here's one of my favorite. Lately, some of the groups that have been funded by a large foundation that'll go unnamed have been talking about rigor, relevance, and relationships. I hate the word rigor. I hate the word rigor, and we need to stop using it. Look it up in a dictionary. Rigor, as in stiff, unbending, unyielding, harsh, i.e., rigor mortis. That's what I want for my kid, a dead, unyielding curriculum. Absolutely. No, we need to talk about schools that are challenging and engaging. Kids need to be engaged. They need to be challenged. They don't need to have rigor forced on them. We literally need to change the language, and I think that's part of what, that's part of the building the movement piece that Bill was getting at, that I was sitting here getting excited about and jotting notes about what I need to do when I get back.
So I don't know exactly what Ohio is going to do about it, but when I was listening to George talk, it just seems like there are a whole lot of things up in the air, and there isn't any reason to stay in the classroom now.
Especially the crisis facing American public schools. So she talks about, in that with Bill Gates, that we're operating with a structure, right, that serves students built on the industrial age.
I don't think there's the realization that what we're doing right now for all kids isn't preparing them to use their heart and their mind well in an active democracy.
I think that the focus needs to shift to these things that we've been talking about and educating the whole child. When you talk about building a classroom community, I call it the trip test, where, you know, I teach fifth graders and they're pretty awkward, and at some point somebody trips up the stairs or down the stairs on a weekly basis, and at the beginning of the year someone trips, and what does everybody do? Laugh. And I always know we are coming together, we have gotten to this point of being a community when someone trips and everybody rushes to help.
Public education is a national good. It is a national treasure. Certainly, there are public schools that aren't working well. Certainly, there are public schools that are working terrifically. The issue is not how to end the system then. The issue is how to help every school be that terrific school. And that's what we're not doing. And so when people come in and say, oh, well, we'll fix it, we'll just bail out of the public system, well, you know what? There's a whole lot of data out there now that says private schools don't do anything any better, you know? And so, and the danger with privatization is, look, I run a public high school. We open the doors to every single kid. It doesn't make any difference if they are physically or mentally disabled or handicapped. It doesn't make any difference if they're white or African American. It doesn't make any difference if they're male or female. All that matters is that they're between the ages of about 13 and 19 and they live in our school district, and we educate all of them. That is an American value. That's an American good, that we all go to school together, because we are we hold ourselves up to be a democratic society, which is a society of equals. And let me tell you, if we're going to go around the world and say we're going to foist democracy on everybody else, we ought to foist a little democracy on ourselves. And it starts in our public schools.